Hello and welcome to Journalists Hangout UK. This is a show where we discuss issues both African and worldwide which are affecting the continent. And we look at how those issues are seen at home and in the African diaspora. I'm Tamsan Ngajou and I'm pleased to welcome our panel. Vuyiswa Ngubongwana, a broadcaster, Priscilla Mwipo, public affairs analyst, and Ayo Johnson, journalist and specialist in African affairs. Now, agriculture is a big deal. It's about the politics of the tummy. And we know that about 32% of the African GDP owes its contribution to agriculture in particular. And there's more money that appears to be going in. Vuyiswa, if I start with you, in the bigger picture, do people at village level see agriculture as important as maybe the national governments see it to be a priority?
I think in the rural areas, they do see it as important because it's the difference between life and death, literally. And also, from an African perspective, you look at the whole continent and how the continent was captured. The purpose was to grab the land, and the land is still under occupation. Let's be really honest, okay? Let's really be honest. When you look at African use of land, who is owning African land? Okay, let's just take the case of South Africa, for example.
Zimbabwe,
now, there's a big contrast. You think, hold on a minute, all those years of liberation struggle, and still 80% of the land is being run by corporate interests outside of Africa. Well, the same is true the whole of Africa. And so when you discuss agriculture, let's not forget that as an underpinning, and we start critiquing the governments who are trying to juggle all these differing interests and at the same time trying to explain to their population why their rich resources are not being utilized for their benefit.
I beg to differ somewhat.
Please do.
Okay, no, I was going to bring you up actually and say in most of West Africa, the land is still in the hands of the African people, but about 70% of the people that we know informally and formally are employed, maybe in one way or the other, in agriculture.
Well, I can't say 70% of the people that we know are employed formally or informally. Unfortunately, Africa has not. Africa is it's a continent that has vast arable land. It has the weather, it has everything that it needs to be able to have a good agricultural industry that feeds the world. Yeah. Once upon a time, we said Zimbabwe was feeding the world. Now, we do have rural communities in Africa, and most of them are either farmers or fishermen, right around Africa, north, south, east, and west. Now, those rural communities have not lost their land or the use of their land. Yes, we have occupation in Zimbabwe. We had occupation in Zimbabwe. We have in South Africa. But the land was returned to the Zimbabwean people. That was what Mugabe fought for.
Hold that thought. I want to come back to that point, but I want to bring Ayo in. When you look on a global scale, Ayo, only about 1% or 2%, if you are being nice to figures, will represent the global export of agriculture by Africa. And people are saying, well, it's not developed, no irrigation, it's not commercialized enough. How do you see that?
Well, I think we're going to go back to colonial days. I think we were sold a lie. When the colonial masters were in, especially like Britain, for example, they made sure that all they were interested was in raw materials, which was like our gold, our diamonds, and our iron ore. And they made sure that the infrastructure for that, to remove it from the country, existed. The aspect that they did not focus on was agriculture, because they didn't want our food at any time. So when the Brits left, when colonialism finished off, we didn't invest as a people in the infrastructure to help our communities to be able to sustain the agriculture, which we clearly need. And instead, our mindset was all about gold and diamonds, when the truth of the nature was that we needed our land, we needed agriculture.
Yeah, you were about to disagree with Priscilla, and this is what I wanted to, it's about the land ownership.
You've just taken a huge jump from the colonial days to, why can't these Africans get it together? You also forget that what's in place is a political structure. There are many layers to colonialism and neocolonialism. So, okay, hand back the land to the people, but put in place a government and millions of governments, officials, who will sustain the colonial system on your behalf. And this is what Africa is trudging through over many decades to cut through all of that
let me help
and
you.
have infrastructure and individuals in place
let me help you.
who are helping the continent, not ones who are just helping themselves.
Well, let me help you. It comes down to the fact that we are evolving as a people. Our industrialization is now, it wasn't in the 1960s. Then we were colonized. So we cannot compare with what you aspire to, what you see in the West here with where we are with Africa. Africa is trying to develop, it's trying to industrialize, but it has many constraints. It's saying that there's ozone issues at the moment. We got fossil fuels.
I can't agree with that. I
yeah.
can't agree with that. That just because we're saying that there's a problem with the weather, the ozone and so on, that is preventing Africa from doing what Africa needs to do. Now, I appreciate that, yes, colonial rule is still, you know, different levels going on in Africa, but it doesn't prevent Africans from considering African interests as a priority.
Well,
the failure now.
Maybe the question, Priscilla, that I should be asking all of you guys is the funding, right? If you take Zimbabwe as an example, which is what South Africa is trying to avoid, where once the land was taken from those that were utilizing it, the banks then closed shop and decided no inputs, no loans, nothing. And the markets also closed. So if you were a farmer, you were stuck with a product, you had no inputs for next season, but you also had no market for whatever you have.
That's why you can't discuss Africa in isolation from a global capitalist system that works in unison. So you can critique Mugabe till the cows come home, but if you don't understand what he was up against in taking the land back and trying to retrain people who were more used to carrying a gun than they were used to carrying a hoe to rebuild their land. It's a mindset. You don't change your mindset overnight.
What stopped Zimbabwe from trading with the rest of Africa? What stopped them from creating new trading partners within Africa? I know what Mugabe was against. Okay. I know what he was up against, but it did not prevent.
Where was South Africa when Mugabe was free to do that?
I am also fully aware of the situation when the land was being handed over. It wasn't done with a plan to sustain or for a future. It was just done randomly. Okay. You know, it was done within ethnic groups. It was done according to who you knew.
But had they not done that,
but it didn't have to be that way.
Let's bring in Ayo.
Hindsight is so clever.
Which I didn't finish my point earlier on, is that the Kyoto Agreement, for example, which is where we are, stipulates the amount of carbon monoxide that you can actually put into the environment. When Britain was industrializing and polluting the world, they didn't have those Kyoto agreements. Now that we want to industrialize, they bring all these new rules to make sure that we're curtailed. And it's that restriction that affects us in our development. So the question is, no, it does. And you can combine that with the financial systems, you can combine that with the fact that we don't have markets, you can combine that with the fact that their producers here are subsidized, and of course we can't compete with them.
That's more important than a Kyoto agreement.
Yeah, but it's a combination of many factors.
Right, Viswa, you're well traveled. When you look at what has happened in the Asian countries, for instance, they have linked development to what's happening in agriculture. We've seen that in the West. We've seen, places like Singapore going out and, sponsoring some people who might give them the products they need. And it doesn't look like there is a plan within Africa. What do you think Africa can do in order to maximize or commercialize agriculture?
You see, if Africa could work more cohesively with the already existing bodies, unifying bodies that it has, you've got your SADC, you've got your ECOWAS, you've got the African Union, for crying out loud. If only they could utilize what already exists in a more effective way to talk about the long-term planning that hindsight teaches us Mugabe could have got it right. But who else did he have to compare himself with? And was South Africa there to help? Was Botswana there? This is what history is teaching us. Yeah. So we mustn't be too harsh on the ones that didn't make it. But we must also not stop criticizing the bodies that are supposed to be doing this.
Hold on. Priscilla, Nigeria is trying to feed itself and has capacity to do that. Absolutely. It's mostly women who are working the land to produce whatever is needed. What do you think the government needs to do going forward to make sure that that is a success?
Okay. First of all, Mugabe is a highly intelligent man and can and could have planned. regarding Nigeria. Now, you know,
very quickly.
everything we need is there. They need to put laws in place. Access to finance is extremely necessary. The biggest problem Nigeria has right now is that the ordinary man cannot access finance that can sustain their business. The interest rates are so high, and when they go in for finance, they're asked to bring their great-grandmother, you know, all kinds of things that is virtually impossible for them. So I think that the policies need to make it a lot more easier. Some kind of subsidy provision, a lot of training, and all of that.
I want to come back and find out what Ayo thinks about that, but we're just going to take a quick break now. We have plenty more to discuss, so please join us in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to Journalists Hangout UK. I'm Tamsan Jhuk, and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel, Vuyiswa Ngobongwana, Priscilla Ngwipo, and Ayo Johnson. We were talking about agriculture and what Africa needs to do. Ayo, let me start with you. I've got a friend who is promising spaghetti roads if he's elected, which is a good idea. But the question being, do you really need that? How does Africa make a determination of what it actually needs versus what it can spend to sustain infrastructure?
Well, there's a three-pronged strategy, and I think Africans have been shown a great level of sophistication. The first is they acknowledge that the West, and especially the colonial masters, did a very bad job with the infrastructure. They recognized, they said, well, fair enough, let's take our destiny now on hands, let's not trust them anymore, let's go to the Chinese. So the Chinese can actually build our roads, our bridges, and so on and so forth, which they have been doing for the last 10 years, but it's not been good enough. Now they're talking about how does it fit into our government strategy, our policies that we have, which is much more specific, like we have in Kenya at the moment, where they're doing rail that's sponsored by the Chinese. In Sierra Leone, for example, they're doing roads, you know, sponsored by the Chinese. So I think African leaders are showing great level of sophistication, understanding exactly what they need now, and they know exactly they can go to a player who they've chosen at the expense of another.
Yeah, Nigeria has quite some potential. Very good business opportunities, especially for the diaspora, in infrastructure. The government has spoken about restructuring, about diversifying away from oil. But of course, we had that incident where one of the oil tankers blew, and you know the consequences that we can see. So even Lagos, when the president was in Lagos, people couldn't travel. So how do you see the country, you know, grappling those opportunities and the diaspora taking part?
I'm hoping that, you know, these unfortunate incidents that Nigeria is currently experiencing will be sufficient awakening for the country to realize what is necessary, and rather than slow foot about it, actually move with the necessary speed, focus, intention, requirement, but above all, interest of Nigeria's growth and development to do this. At the moment, Nigeria is just hampered and stranded by ethnic divides and conversations and religious interest that has no bearing on our development and our growth as a nation. And I hope that Nigeria can take advantage right now with the incident that you made mention thereof in Lagos. This was a road that only recently was being built, and it's a very, very important road for the agriculture, for economic development in Lagos, because this is a road that transports people in and out of Lagos to other regions of the country, particularly business travels and so on. So for that road to be on fire, as it was yesterday, I would imagine would prevent a lot of business travel that would now affect, you know, business development within the area. So Nigeria really needs to harness her potential.
Let me bring in Vuyiswa here. As a sister, you know, we have often been criticized, Zimbabwe and South Africa, for relying on infrastructure that was built during the colonial times, and using labor from Malawi and Zambia in particular, people that came. So it wasn't necessarily Zimbabweans or South Africans that were working the mines, the railway lines. It was mostly people from other countries, but as a colonial legacy. Is that fair?
You mean the criticism?
Yeah. That we are only boasting of having this infrastructure, the good railways, the roads, simply because those are the two countries that benefited
It's
from
a terribly
the
self-destructive finger pointing at yourself when you criticize another
these
African
are other people
nations.
saying to us, we are defending ourselves.
Right, other Africans
Yes.
saying this.
Yes.
This is what I'm saying. I'm a Pan-Africanist. I see the continent as one house, and I don't prefer one room to another. And therefore, when you look at the infrastructure of the whole continent as a whole, all of them are facing the same dynamics of dealing with ethnicity and divisions, all those divisions that colonial masters of control have exacerbated in different ways that we are only just beginning to be aware of. So let's not dismiss that like nothing, because Frantz Fanon warned us about dismissing that as nothing, because you can never underestimate the power of the mind. When you've got people's minds, don't care what infrastructure you have in place, you can make them run around like robots doing to your own call. So we can have all the infrastructure we want, but if we don't have the right mindset, first of all, we won't even be able to build it, because we'll be fighting each other like is happening in Nigeria, and there's different priorities. And when other people start pointing, like you were saying, they look at South Africa. We've suffered so much under apartheid. And then on top of all that, this is how much self-hate Africans have for each other. All they can focus on is, oh, well, look at you and your infrastructure. It's better than ours, but look who built it. This is the problem. We need discussions that open us up and bring us together. And we can't do it if we only look at one layer at the exclusion of the ones that created the one layer. That's what frustrates me about these type of discussions.
It's a good point to bring in, Ayo. You know, this master plan and thinking, changing the mindset. The African Union is trying to do that by saying that they've got this agenda 2063 and then 2020 something, where they will say they want to link all the capital cities together. And in East Africa, of course, they're already beginning to do that with the railway line. Do you think that can work?
Well, that's called a wish list. I mean, I've got a wish list. I would like to own a plane. I would like to own my own land, my own island. You know, is it ever going to happen? No. So we've got to be realistic with what we ask for, and we've got to be appreciative of where we've come from. South Africa, for example, the reason why it's slightly better in terms of its infrastructure is to be thankful to the apartheid movement, because at least white South Africa maintained that. If it had been left in black hands, like we saw across the rest of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen exactly how destructive that has become. So we've got to be appreciative of certain things and what our limitations are. And if we appreciate that we've got limitations...
Can I just stop you right
will be
there?
people that
Can
will
we stop this ignorant talk right now?
No,
because you've just dismissed our whole history as being wholly dependent on having white people to take care of business.
Well, if we're dealing with infrastructure, then we've got to look like for like. The reason why South Africa's infrastructure is where it is because white people were managing that. At least we got that right.
But
so at least where we are. No, let's be honest about it.
Are you trying
the rest
to say
of sub-Saharan Africa,
that
for
South
example,
Africa
could
only work because white people put us under the cosh to build an infrastructure?
I never said, I said that's one of the benefits. If you say that was a good thing that we have.
I feel I can't imagine.
I can't even countenance this.
This is what Helen Zille was in trouble for. Access to finance was coming because of those governments, but the people were actually doing the work. So if you take it away from where Helen Zille was in trouble for, how do you want to advance that?
You make it seem as though Africans were free to do, and they refused. And I think that's wrong. And there are a lot of people who are watching who will be so angry at that line of thought.
Well, no, it's not.
But let me say this.
Yeah.
And I think we've said it numerous times on this couch that about the colonial masters that were in place and still are.
Yep.
They may not be visible today.
Yep.
But you made mention in another show that we did the fact that the wars that were going on in Ethiopia and Eritrea were being sponsored.
Yes.
And now we're calling for peace, but then we see that some ugly heads are raising, throwing grenades here and there to try and prevent that. And if care is not taken, the Prime Minister that is running after peace today, let's just see how long it will be for his survival. His survival is crucial.
Yep.
So I don't accept, nor do I agree that Africa failed that badly by themselves. That they weren't able to build infrastructure. I believe if they had access to finance, I believe that if they had been permitted to run as they wanted to.
Let me give him the right to reply. Let me give him the right to reply. Let me give him the right to reply first.
So the bottom line
to be fair.
To be fair, thank you. The bottom line is we talked about infrastructure and we said that South Africa's infrastructure is so much better. And all I was saying is that the reason why it's so much better is because during that era of apartheid, the white South Africa that were running South Africa at the moment at that time got sponsorship support and they built an infrastructure. But that's the truth. That's a fact.
If black South Africans went for it, they wouldn't have got it.
Hold on. Apartheid was mentioned, so I will give you the last word, but very quickly.
The question is not our ability to do or not to do. So it was us who created the infrastructure within South Africa. So it's just a question of who's ruling and taking care of business. When Kwame Nkrumah tried to do it for Ghana, they sabotaged his whole administration.
And the CIA
and Sankara got killed for it.
Hold on, guys.
And so what happened to Lumumba? He died for that.
And who was at the heart of that? The US.
I want this discussion to continue, but our set is done. But of course, JHUK is going to take a very short break for its summer holiday, and we will be back in September. Don't forget to follow us on Real JHUK on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Tamsin Rajo, and from the entire team here in London, goodbye and thank you for watching JHUK.